End time lessons from the book of James. The book of James seems to divide itself into two parts, the first of which presents admonitions and exhortations appropriate to the entire church throughout the gospel age. The second part of the book of James presents warnings specifically intended for the feet members of the church in the harvest, even in the late harvest of the gospel age, our day. So I'd like to discuss both of these themes of the book of James by pretending that James is really two books, two epistles, 1 James and 2 James. 1 James in this illustration is what we call James 1:1 through James 4:12. 2 James is what we call James 4:13 through the end of the book, James 5:20. Let's consider 1 James, which sets the stage for the end time lessons in 2 James. I've subtitled it, The First Epistle General of James to the Entire Church of God Throughout the Gospel Age. In this book, James gives us 5 lessons for developing the Christ-like character that will be necessary for us to make our calling and election sure. We'll cover these 5 lessons just briefly. I'll list them in very abbreviated form, and then read a scripture or two from the book of 1 James that illustrates the lesson. And the first of these 5 lessons is, trials will test your faith and develop your patience. And this first lesson is presented in James chapter 1, verses 1 through 21. The first 21 verses of the book. We'll read just James 1, verses 2 to 4 and 12. That's a typographical error, by the way. It should be 12. My brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into divers temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. The second of our 5 lessons in 1 James is, add to your faith works, which is the theme of James 1:22 through 27, and also James chapter 2, verses 14 to 26. Let's first read James 1:22. But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. And also James 2:17, 24, and 26. Even so faith, if it hath not works, is dead, being alone. Ye see then how that by works a man is justified, and not by faith only. For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. The third of these 5 foundational lessons in 1 James is, subtract from your faith partiality. And this lesson is given in James chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. Here's James chapter 2, verses 1 and 9. My brethren, have not the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with respect of persons, or that is partiality. And before I read verse 9, recall Brother Leo Post's excellent discourse yesterday on the royal law. And the theme text of his discourse was James 2, verse 8. The verse that immediately precedes verse 9. And that verse said, if ye keep the royal law, ye do well. And then verse 9 follows, but. That word but tells us this is the opposite. This is what it means if you don't keep the royal law. But if ye have respect to persons, that is partiality, ye commit sin, and are convinced or convicted, would be a better word in our modern English, of the law as transgressors. The fourth lesson from the book of 1 James is, the power of the tongue is multiplied greatly, particularly for evil. It's found in James 3, verses 1 through 13. We'll read chapter 3, verses 2, 5, 8, and 20. For in many things we offend all. That is, we all offend. If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body. Even so the tongue is a little member, and boasteth great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindleth. But the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. Out of the same mouth proceedeth blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be. And the fifth and last lesson of 1 James, written to the entire church of God throughout the gospel age, is, envy and strife will divide you. Keep unity and peace among yourselves by being examples one to another of meekness, humility, and righteousness. This lesson is taught in James 3:13 through chapter 4, verse 12. Listen to James 3:13, 14, 17, and 18. Who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of a good conversation or out of a good conduct his works with meekness of wisdom. But if ye have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not and lie not against the truth. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, hearkening back to a previous lesson, and without hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. This fifth lesson continues in James chapter 4, verses 10 and 11. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up. Speak not evil of one another, brethren. He that speaketh evil of his brother and judgeth his brother speaketh evil of the law and judgeth the law. But if thou judge the law, thou art not a doer of the law, but a judge. So again, I've covered these briefly, but recapping these 5 foundational lessons once again, appropriate to the entire church throughout the gospel age, we have trials will test your faith and develop your patience. Add to your faith works. Subtract from your faith partiality. The power of the tongue is multiplied greatly, particularly for evil. Envy and strife will divide you. Keep unity and peace among yourselves by being examples of meekness, humility, and righteousness. Notice the words test, add, subtract, multiplied, and divide in these lessons. So you see, the Apostle James was not only an apostle, he was a math teacher as well. That brings us to the book of 2 James. And I'd like to suggest again that this last portion of James could almost be a separate book, because here James seems to go forward in time to the end of the gospel age, to the end times of the gospel age, to the harvest of the gospel age, and even to a time late in the harvest, to our day. And he gives in this fictitious book of 2 James 3 warnings, particularly applicable to us now, in our time, and in this place. So I've subtitled this imaginary book of 2 James, the second epistle general of James to the saints of God in the end times of the gospel age, particularly to those gathered in convention in Orlando, Florida, March of the year 2001. I'll tell you what the 3 warnings to us are, and then we'll examine each one of them in some detail. The first end time warning is, economically, the end times will often be good. Don't be distracted by material opportunities and successes that you may enjoy. The second warning is, economically, the end times will occasionally be bad. Don't become discouraged, frustrated, or impatient. And the third warning related to these first 2 is, when times are bad, and some of your brethren are in material need, those of you who prospered in the good times must not fail to help your needy brethren. So those are the 3 end time warnings, but don't forget those first 5 lessons from the book of 1 James, because we're going to see them woven into James's discourse on these 3 end time lessons. We're going to see them in the background of the 3 warnings. 2 James begins with James 4:13 and ends with the end of the book, James 5:20. And this book begins with the words, go to now, which have the meaning of listen up, I'm about to say something important. And James uses that expression not once, but twice. The first usage is in connection with the first of the three end-time warnings in James 4, verses 13 through 16. Go to now. Listen up. Ye that say, today or tomorrow we will go into such a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get gain. Whereas ye know not what shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away. For that ye ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. But now ye rejoice in your boastings. All such rejoicing is evil. The last few decades have been mostly good times, economically. Brethren today, in our country at least, have more in the way of material gain than at any other time in the gospel age. And with the good times come two temptations. The temptation to think that the good times will last forever, and the temptation to plan our lives in expectation of continued good times. And these two temptations are very subtle. They can affect our thinking almost without our being aware of it. It becomes natural for us to start thinking about how we'll save this much money for so long a time so that we can make that purchase next month or take this trip next year. James's warning to us is to think rather in terms of, am I ready to render up the account of my life tomorrow, if the Lord should demand it of me? Jesus himself taught this lesson in the parable of the rich man, who said in Luke 12:19-21, And I will say to my soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall these things be which thou hast provided? So is he that layeth up treasure for himself, and is not rich toward God. It is a trial to our faith to be well off materially, because our flesh gets comfortable with the little luxuries that money can buy and wants to stay comfortable. So the first of James's three end-time warnings is, don't be distracted by material opportunities and successes. Now I want to digress here for a moment to make sure I'm not misunderstood. I'm not suggesting that we should make little or no effort to provide the things needful for the material support of ourselves and those dependent upon us. Clearly the Scriptures teach our responsibility along those lines. What I'm emphasizing is that there is a proper balance somewhere between dwelling too much on material matters and not doing our rightful share. And it is for each of us to determine where between those two extremes the proper balance in our lives and in our situation lies. But in the end times, the pull of the world will be strong to draw us towards spending too much time on material matters and to lose that proper balance. Remember again those 5 lessons from 1 James that I said we'd see in the background of these 3 end-time warnings? Well, the lesson from 1 James underlying this first end-time warning is, trials will test your faith, and prosperity is a test of our faith and of our zeal. James's second end-time warning is in James 5:1-4. Go to now. There's listen up again. Ye rich men, this time. Weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are cankered, and the rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire. Ye have heaped treasure together for the last days. Behold, the hire of the laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you, kept back by fraud, crieth. And the cries of them which have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth, that is, the Lord of hosts, Jehovah. Notice the time-setting clue given to us in this passage. It's the words, "for the last days," in verse 3, which tell us that this message is for the harvest, the end times of the gospel age. The best explanation of this passage of Scripture, James 5, 1 through 4, always has been and still is the 4th volume chapter entitled The Cries of the Reapers. That's volume 4, chapter 8, which begins on page 385. Brother Russell explains the fraud mentioned in verse 4 as being the demonetization of silver in the year 1872, which put farmers at a disadvantage because primarily silver was used as money in the rural communities and by the working classes, while primarily gold was used as money by banks and corporations in the cities. After the year 1872, farmers still received payment for their crops in less valuable demonetized silver, but had to pay their mortgages and buy their farm machinery and equipment with more costly gold. They got paid in silver, but had to buy with gold. Now you may be wondering what a seemingly historically trivial event, the demonetization of silver, has to do with us in these end times. And the answer is everything. Raise your hand if you have at least one credit card in your wallet. I see almost every hand in the audience going up. If silver had not been demonetized in the year 1872, there would be no Visa, no MasterCard, no American Express, no miles, no points. Now I'll bet you think the demonetization of silver is very relevant to us in these end times. I don't have time to go into all of the details, but here's the quick history. Prior to 1872, the United States was said to be on the silver standard and on the gold standard because two things were true. The federal government fixed the price of an ounce of silver and an ounce of gold. An ounce of silver was worth $2 and an ounce of gold was worth $32. And the federal government would agree to exchange paper money for dust or nuggets of silver or gold at that exchange rate, or vice versa. So you could freely trade in your paper money for the precious metal, or trade in your precious metal for the paper money. That's what it meant to be on the silver standard or on the gold standard. After the year 1872, our country was said to be on the gold standard because only gold, not silver, had its price fixed by the government, and you could exchange the gold for the paper money and so on. An ounce of gold was still worth 32 paper dollars, but the price of an ounce of silver fluctuated up and down, mostly down according to an economic market. Again, farmers held their money in silver because it was more common in the rural areas, whereas gold was the more common money metal in the commercial trade of the banks and the corporations in the city. And so that's how farmers lost much of their wealth, while banks and businesses came out ahead when silver was demonetized. When Volume 4 was written, silver had lost half its value since 1872. You could now only get one paper dollar for an ounce of silver. In the reprints, and I think in Volume 4 as well, but I didn't take the time to find the reference, Brother Russell quotes William Jennings Bryan, who you might recognize as the lawyer who helped prosecute John Scopes, a Tennessee high school teacher who was found guilty of teaching the theory of evolution in 1925, contrary to Tennessee law. 30 years earlier, a much younger William Jennings Bryan, then a champion of the common people, ran for president. At the 1896 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, one issue of debate was free silver, which was sort of like a return to the silver standard. Bryan gave a famous speech that came to be known as the Cross of Gold speech, in which he said this to his opponents, who demanded that the country remain only on a gold standard. Having behind us, that is, on our side, the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the common commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. They just don't speechify like that anymore, do they? Well, Bryan won the nomination at the age of 36, but lost the election to the Republican candidate, William McKinley, in that same year. And it's easy to see why Brother Russell regarded William Jennings Bryan as a man of some nobility of character and respected his insight on the demonetization of silver, that current issue of the day. But again, you may be wondering, well, what does all this have to do with our subject of James 5:1 through 4? Here's how that speech and the demonetization of silver connects to the second end-time warning. Initially, all banks could print paper money as an easier way to carry gold around, but they could only print 32 paper dollars for each ounce of gold they had in their vaults. And that makes sense. Then the decision was made to allow national banks to print more money than they had gold in their vaults. And this extra money would be backed by the U.S. government in the form of bonds, which was nothing more than a promise to repay paper money with more paper money. Remember that phrase, because in a few minutes I'll show you where I stole it from Brother Russell. Now that sounds irresponsible and illegal, doesn't it? But in banking terms, it's called the full faith and credit of the United States. If you try to do that with your own checkbook, it's called grand larceny and you go to jail. But this has been an accepted banking practice now for decades, and it created a bubble of wealth because now there was more money to go around than before. There was more money that could be loaned out by banks at interest to people who could then use that money to buy farms and build houses and start businesses. So there was some good in this. But at least there was always some gold to back up some of the paper money, if not at all. Next, in the year 1913, the Federal Reserve Bank was created, whose present chairman is the very famous Alan Greenspan. And finally, our country demonetized gold and went off the gold standard in the year 1933, so that now there is no silver or gold at a fixed price backing up the Federal Reserve notes that we all carry in our wallets. That's what it says on the top. Let me make the point. The two most important outcomes of all of these events that I've traced the history of for the end times is both good news and bad news. The good news is that the creation of all of this virtual money since the year 1872 has enabled our economy to expand and provide good jobs and a comfortable standard of living for hundreds of millions of Americans. Companies have borrowed some of the extra money to build new factories and hire more workers at good wages. People borrowed money to buy automobiles and build homes. Banks were very willing to loan this extra money to almost anyone by issuing them a credit card. And so, in the 1970s, the two most frequently used words in the English language were, charge it. None of us would enjoy the good standard of living we presently have today if silver were not demonetized in 1872 and all of those other events that I described followed. But, and here's the bad news, the bubble cannot continue to grow or even to stay where it's at much longer. Now, you know, economists have been predicting a devastating worldwide depression for a long time. So long, in fact, that people tend to ignore their warnings, much the same way we ignore people standing on street corners with a megaphone saying the end is near. We believe that Alan Greenspan can keep the good times rolling forever, but one of these days, the economists will be right. You know, when I've studied prophecy, and I'm sure you have too, I have long believed that the final sequence of events that completes the tearing down of this present evil world and the old social order will begin with a rapid economic collapse. In days, if not in hours, because the global economy is so intertwined between nations and so vulnerable to a collapse that begins in one small remote corner of that global economy. Following that rapid economic collapse will be civil unrest, social upheaval, the failure of governments to maintain order, and anarchy. In fact, Brother Russell predicted just exactly that sequence of end-time events in the foreword to Volume 4. If you haven't read it recently, I highly recommend it. You'll be amazed how current for our day his observations were in 1916. Here's a portion of page 2 of the 1916 volume, foreword to Volume 4. The debts of the warring nations are authoritatively stated to amount to $55 billion, a sum which, of course, can never be paid in gold, and everybody knows that there is not sufficient gold to pay the interest on the debts of the world. This spells bankruptcy. As soon as the war shall end and the issuing of bonds shall cease to provide money for the repayment of the interest on other bonds, repaying paper money with more paper money, as I said before. The nations are thus falling into the chasm of bankruptcy. But it is with them as with a human being falling. The sensations are not so bad until the falling ceases in a demoralizing concussion. What Brother Russell saw in his day was the beginnings of the inflationary bubble caused by the demonetization of silver and the printing of more money than there was gold in the vaults of the banks. He knew that relatively small bubble compared to today would have to burst. But what he didn't foresee is how much higher the bubble would get over the next 100 years to our day, and therefore how much deeper that chasm of bankruptcy, as he put it, would become. James counsels patience in the face of the coming economic trouble and even ruin, brethren, that some of us may suffer as a result of these things. James 5, 7 and 8. Be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman waiteth for the precious fruit of the earth, and hath long patience for it, until he receive the early and latter rain. Be ye also patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. So James's second end-time warning is, economically, the end times will occasionally be bad. And brethren, this could mean really bad. Don't become discouraged or impatient. The kingdom is coming just as surely as the seasonal rains, the early and latter rain that bring forth the fruit to the earth. Wait patiently for it, if you must. Recall again the 5 lessons from 1 James. The lesson from 1 James underlying this second end-time warning is the same as before. Trials, particularly trials along the line of financial reversals now, will test your faith and develop your patience. So the first end-time warning is regarding the test of prosperity, and the second end-time warning is regarding the test of poverty. That brings us directly to the third end-time warning from James, which ties these two first end-time warnings together in an interesting way. Let's read James 5, verses 9 and 10. Grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge standeth before the door. Take my brethren the prophets, who have spoken in the name of the Lord, for an example of suffering, affliction, and of patience. Another time-setting clue is given here in this third end-time warning. Behold, the judge standeth before the door. Meaning our returned Lord is present in the harvest in the end of the gospel age. John the Revelator, describing this same end-time period, uses these words in Revelation 3:20. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. Now, at first reading, it might seem that these two verses are simply a continuation of James's exhortation to patience on the part of those who suffer financial loss in the end times, as we read in our second of the 3 end-time warnings. But I see in the first few words of verse 9 a most important piece of advice. Grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. The New American Standard says, do not complain. The thought here is more than just patiently bearing the financial reversals that will come upon some of us, if not all of us. The warning here is that we are not to grumble or complain against our brethren, Now, why would James warn us against that? Why would any of us grumble against our brethren when we are made poor by the financial reversals to come in the bad economic times of the last days? I think the sense of this warning is that the economic times will be hard for some, but not all of us. The warning to those who are hurt by the financial reversals is to not be envious of those who are not made poor, and to not grumble if the better off among us appear to be offering us little or no help. The Lord will judge each one's stewardship and sacrifice, not us. And this third end time warning is also for those who remain financially secure through the hard economic times. The warning to them who are not hurt by the financial reversals is to look after your brethren's material needs and help them. And I think the financial reversals to come may play out among the brethren in two ways. It might be that those who presently have much of this world's good and those who have only a modest amount will be hurt to the same degree, so that those who have little will have nothing, and those who had much will have less, but still more than nothing. Or it might be that those who have much now in the way of this world's goods will lose it all, while those who have a modest amount will retain what they have. And so relatively, they will seem rich compared to their formerly better off brethren who are now made poor. The Apostle John said, and I'm paraphrasing 1 John 3:14, the final test will be love for the brethren. And he went on to say in 1 John 3:17 and 18, but whoso hath this world's good and seeth his brother have need, and shutteth up his bowels of compassion from him, how dwelleth the love of God in him? My little children, let us not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth. In the third end time warning, James echoes John's sentiments. Recall one last time now the 5 lessons from 1 James, especially lessons 2, 3, 4, and 5, which again are woven into and in the background of this third end time warning. Lesson 2 was, add to your faith works, from chapter 2 of James, particularly verses 14 to 16, which I didn't read earlier, but let's look at them now. James 2, 14 to 16. What doth it profit, my brethren, though a man say he hath faith and have not works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister be naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you say unto him, depart in peace, be ye warmed and filled, God bless you and be with you, in other words, notwithstanding ye give them not those things which are needful to the body, what doth it profit? Now, you may be having a hard time imagining such conditions as I'm describing close to home in this country. But I believe it will be so. And in some countries among our brethren in Africa and Eastern Europe, it almost already is this way today. Lesson 3 from 1 James is also contained in this end-time warning. Subtract from your faith partiality. Brother Leo did such a good job of covering this point yesterday that I won't say much except to add a few thoughts to what he presented. There may be a tendency to give greater honor and respect to those who are not hurt as much as others by the financial reversals to come, as if God is indicating his favor upon them by shielding them from the poverty. But the tendency to make such judgment is a tendency of the flesh. There's another form of partiality that we should also avoid, and that is a partiality that has not to do with material means, but with prominence in the truth. We might have the inclination to depend too much upon certain elders in our ecclesia, or certain convention speakers we particularly enjoy. We must resist the temptation to feel that we are right with the Lord because we are part of a certain ecclesia that is prominent in the service to the brethren or in witness efforts. I often joke about myself being a member of the Chicago Ecclesia. And of course, Brother Paul likes to joke about my being a member of the Chicago Ecclesia. But it is each of our own individual responsibilities to make the truth our own and to make our calling and election sure. And along this line, I like the sentiments of the Manna comment for September 17th. I won't take the time to read it now, but I encourage you to consider the Manna comment for September 17th. So let us grudge neither against those who have more in a material way than ourselves, nor against those who have more spiritual opportunities than we may enjoy. Lesson 4 of the 5 foundational lessons in 1 James is also here. The power of the tongue is multiplied greatly, especially for evil. James said, "Grudge not or do not complain against your brethren, even if you think they could do more to help, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge standeth before the door. The Lord will judge the better off among us by their actions and condemn those whose generosity is lacking. The Lord will also judge the less well off among us by our words and condemn those who grudge and groan and grumble against one another." Remember Proverbs 18:21. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. Now here's an interesting aspect of this grudging, almost an irony. The grudging and groaning can be in both directions. Not only might the poor among us grudge against the well-off who seem to hold on to their means, but the more well-off in the hard economic times to come might come to resent and grudge against the less well-off amongst the brethren. Why would the rich groan and grudge against the poor? Well, it might be because the poor brethren among the rich might be a constant reminder to the well-off that they have an opportunity to do more than they have to help. Lastly, our lesson 5 from 1 James is also in the background of this third end-time warning. Envy and strife will divide you. Keep unity and peace among yourselves by being examples of meekness, humility, and righteousness. Now, brethren, we Americans are a proud people. We expect to have more of everything and the best of everything than others. And that arrogant attitude of the flesh can even corrupt the humility of our new creature that we must possess. James ends this second epistle of James with the words in chapter 5, verses 19 and 20. Brethren, if any of you do err from the truth and one convert him, let him know that he which converteth the sinner from the error of his way shall save a soul from death and shall hide a multitude of sins. Erring from the truth, as James puts it here, is not merely or only losing one's understanding of the doctrines of present truth. Erring from the truth here means to depart from the practice of the truth, from living the doctrines of the truth, from living the 5 lessons of 1 James and the 3 end-time warnings of 2 James. And so if in the course of his trial by faith, by diverse temptations, one of our brethren should err from living the truth, our responsibility is to help him, not only in material need, which may appear to be the most immediate concern, but also here where James emphasizes our responsibility to help our brethren in their more important spiritual need. The end times are upon us. Watch out for yourselves in poverty and in wealth, and watch out for your brethren.